species man. If I could get Nick.
I changed the title of the doc, I apologize. It's on, yeah, it's on the same stuff. It was, yeah, it's not different from the abstract, I think, that I sent in. Yeah, this one, yeah, but it begins with the same stuff on family.
You'll have to speak into them.
Oh, right, sorry. I changed the title. I don't hold this away from my, yeah,
You hold that close.
okay. I just have a very loud voice.
Oh,
Um,
then maybe hold it.
Okay. Can everyone online hear me? Oh,
Okay, yes, we're good.
no,
Oh, there's a mouse here.
okay.
Yeah, a little easier.
Oh,
What are you looking for?
just making sure that, yeah, okay, everybody can hear me, it seems, okay. Okay. Yeah, I'll begin. So, hello, my name is Nick, and what I changed the title to was, this is the title of my master's thesis, but it's gonna start with talking about Fanwort and Kasshabog Lake. So the title is Naturalization, Accounting for Naturalization, Ecological Management and Ecology. So before we get on with it, if everybody could form a, it doesn't have to be a pair, but what I want you to discuss amongst yourselves is, even just for a couple of minutes, is so what is your understanding of the word naturalized in the context of ecology? So that being, if a species is naturalized, what does that tell you? So I'd like you to discuss that with the people next to you.
It's something yeah.
Great.
The cost of like the social or environmental.
Debit means only
Yeah, so maybe we'll come back together. What were some of the things that, that meant to you? You can, I don't know, we can go from this side over, or something like that. Yeah, what were some of the things that came up in your conversations?
Okay, I can say something. We were just talking about the naturalization of, say, the red-bellied woodpecker.
Yeah.
It, like 100 years ago, it was south of New York State,
Mhm.
and now it's all over this particular area.
Yeah.
So it's a woodpecker that's not indigenous traditionally to Ontario,
Yep.
and is now making a good living in Ontario.
Right.
So that's what I would call naturalization.
You'll have to
Yeah.
Yeah, so species that wasn't here, sort of, maybe like in the last like couple hundred years, but has made its home here
Yeah.
and is thriving.
But maybe thriving, not to a degree where it starts really affecting like the ecosystem, but it's achieved some sort of balance. And it has like interactions that kind of keep it in check. Like I'm thinking like Phragmites compared to like Queen Anne's lace. Queen Anne's lace feels like a bit more like it's naturalized sort of.
Right. Anything else come up in other people? Yeah, or,
need to repeat it.
oh,
We kind of gave definitive dates, so anything that was not here prior to European settlement,
mhm,
so prior to 1492.
Yep.
And has since come in. So anything that was here, like let's say coyotes that maybe weren't this far north,
mhm,
but did move north in the last, I don't know, few decades, that wouldn't count.
right,
Only if it came from outside the continent and only after colonization.
right. So for those online, what was said was, wasn't here prior to European colonization, and not things that had sort of range expansions within the continent, but things that came from other places and probably as a consequence of European colonization, or just after that time.
Well, I'm assuming they came here because of that.
Yeah,
At least that's what I heard, but I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of gray areas in everything.
yeah,
Including, birds that may have flown over from Africa, et cetera,
right.
with no help from humans.
Yeah, and then what was said before for those online, was that maybe a species that isn't necessarily problematic. So it's something, yeah, within the ecosystem. So something like Queen Anne's lace rather than Phragmites. Other people?
Well, it's I understand it as an alien species that thrives in an area, but not to the extent that it becomes a problem.
Right.
Probably because it's got enough, it discovers enough natural enemies.
Right.
To keep it in check.
Yeah. So for those online, an alien species that doesn't necessarily take over in a place because of natural enemies. What were some of the other clauses you brought up? I apologize.
Well, it thrives in its new environment,
Yeah.
but there's enough limiting factors, things that eat it or disease it or parasitize it.
Right.
But it becomes part of the food chain.
Right.
Food web.
Yeah. So it thrives in a place, but it has plenty of natural enemies that keep it in check, that make it a part of the food web.
Close there. So a species that becomes part of the ecosystem has its own predators, it has its own competitors, it's kept in check. So when you get a novel species like garlic mustard, for instance, it has what's called the novel weapons hypothesis. It takes over. It's got all these novel plant defenses, novel chemicals, nothing's been exposed to them. That takes time, right, for that to evolve in the system. So those kind of invasive species can really spread. And if we look at garlic mustard, there's very little that graze about it.
Mhm.
So even recruiting like parasitoids or other insects that are part of the host that hosted on that plant in Europe, for instance, doesn't happen here. So novel weapons is a feature of the species that's not naturalized. Or even something like dandelions, for instance, have been here for hundreds of years. Yeah, they're thriving in open fields, but they only extremely disturbed areas. They're not going to move into pristine meadows to take over. They've got their own predators, competitors. Their skins pollinate them. They're integrated into the system of all the same.
Right. Yeah. So for those online, not things that have sort of features that prevent them from being integrated into the food web and maybe causing impact, or rather a lack of impact would be something that defines something as naturalized. Is that true? Or I'm doing my best to paraphrase in a concise. Okay. Okay. Okay, I'll move on. The reason I wanted to bring this up is because part of this presentation goes into some things that I thought were strange in the etymology of how this word used in the science that I'm going to be covering. So, so the sort of organizing sort of question for this presentation is, why don't we account for invasive species naturalizing when we manage, the environment? And so there's going to be some sort of series of pieces to this. One is the field study of Fanwort, which is sort of the primary focus. One is a review of definitions I found for this word in the literature. The next is a review of ways that we conceive of how invasions happen, and another is a sort of a look at the, who controls the knowledge in this discipline and why we maybe don't account for this for that reason. So part one. So this is the field study that I did. So I did a field study of this plant called Fanwort in Kasshabog Lake. So this is the flower here. So it's a introduced species. It's considered invasive under the Invasive Species Act in Ontario. Its range, and so this is the plant here. Its range in Ontario is largely limited to the Crow River watershed. So here's the petroglyphs. Okay, actually you can't see that. Okay, and then up around here, so like Kasshabog Lake, Nefton is where its range is limited to in Ontario. It's made it down to Round Lake. But this is its range in Ontario. Anyhow, so what did I do? So what I did was a revisit of a 2008 impact study. So what we wanted to see is, over time, how has the impact of this plant changed on the ecosystem, and has that impact changed to the extent that we might consider it naturalized now? So I repeated the methods that were done in this impact study in a series of 6 sites. 3 of them had Fanwort in 2008, and 3 of them didn't. So the 3 that didn't were our reference sites. So the question was, has Fanwort significantly naturalized in the bays where it's been present for at least 14 years? So in terms of defining what that means precisely, I didn't come across any sort of measurable criteria to really, that anybody else had come up with to define what I meant in a measurable sense and a falsifiable sense. So what I went with was, so if significant naturalization has occurred, the structural metrics of the invaded community would be at levels similar to those of pre-invasion, so in the reference community, and that the invasive species, so in this case the Fanwort, would be still just as widespread, but in nowhere near as the same abundance as it was at the when it was at its peak. So what did I do specifically? So I sampled the plants and the macroinvertebrates in the community. We revisited the macroinvertebrates just to see if there were any other effects. I'll get to that later. But anyway, so in terms of the actually what I did to sort of study the plants, we got in the water, laid out a bunch of yellow rope with pool noodles on it as our transect lines, and then we dived down to the bottom, put down a quadrat, scoop out all the biomass, put them in a bag, take them back to the shore, sort them by species, and then collect wet weights by species for each quadrat. And so anyway, that was what we did to collect the vegetation data. And then for the macroinvertebrates, we did D-net sweeps off the side of a boat at six different points in each of the bays, and then counted the first 100 of each of the invertebrates, and then identified them to order or family. So what did I find? So what I found was that in the sites where Fanwort had been present for at least 14 years, Fanwort biomass had dropped off significantly, so about by 66% per unit of area. And then in all the reference sites, the Fanwort then invaded because it was in the same lake. And so these are not used as a reference. Anyway, the proportion of community biomass that it represented also dropped off significantly. However, it was still just as widespread, or it was not significantly different with regard to its widespreadedness within the site. So occurrence is just a number of quadrats where the Fanwort was present. In terms of the community metrics, so the sites where Fanwort had been present for at least 14 years did significantly recover to the extent that they were not significantly different from the reference sites on both measures of Simpson's and Shannos diversity. Quadrat richness increased over time, and I think that this is largely explained by the fact that there's just an additional species present, because the site with the lowest amount of average species richness is the reference site. And then total biomass remains elevated. I'm not sure exactly how to interpret this, but nonetheless, the community is still significantly different than it was in the pre-invaded state. In terms of this, I really need to make this into a series of graphs because the table is like almost unreadable. Anyway, long story short, what I found with the invertebrate data was that the relative abundance of fanwort, more or less, did not predict pretty well didn't predict the composition of the community of macroinvertebrates. So it seemed to have, the macroinvertebrates did not seem to care whether fanwort was present or not. So is there evidence of significant naturalization? So based on the criteria I laid out. So fanwort abundance has dropped off relative to a peak while remaining widespread. There are indications that diversity has recovered similar to levels similar to pre-invasion, though total community biomass does remain elevated, and there's no clear impact on the macroinvertebrate community at the level of identification I looked at. So based on what I observed, I think yes. I think that some significant naturalization has occurred. And then, anyway, this is sort of just a theorized relationship that I think will maybe become more relevant later. But anyway, but basically it's just showing that there's an inverse relationship between diversity and the biomass of the invader, and that this pattern could probably be predicted over the residency time of that organism within a site. So as I delved into the literature after doing the study, I encountered the invasion biology literature that was the place where I was supposed to be drawing a lot of my work or references from. And I went into this with an understanding of what naturalization meant, which was, something to do with community integration. And what I encountered in the literature was kind of funny. So this paper by David Richardson in 2000 is the paper where the term naturalization as it's used in invasion biology comes from. So it presents a framework for how all invasions are theorized to proceed. And it is easily one of the most cited papers and most influential papers that strongly influence how we manage invasions, or at least puts forward the philosophy for how we manage invasions in pretty well most like North America and Europe. So anyway, so very influential and relevant to naturalization. So anyway, I'm just gonna summarize the difference in their definition from my understanding of it. Whereas I would say that a naturalized state probably follows an invasive state because it indicates integration, they would say the opposite. So it refers only to the beginning of wild reproduction. I found that very strange. And the reason that I thought this was relevant is that, so this is one of the chief derivatives of this work. And the reason this is relevant, so this is the sort of gold standard description of how all invasions happen. And within this framework, I think what stood out to me most is that, so as you can see, naturalized happens before invasive, but there is no conception that invasive species can become part of an ecosystem here. So something is naturalized, it becomes invasive, and then there is no description, I felt, of what I observed. Something is invasive, it's problematic, and then, it can slowly become part of an ecosystem. And so I feel that there's a phenomenon here that is entirely missing from the way that we conceive of and look at biological invasions, because we don't account for integration. So how did they come to define naturalization in that way? Because I found that definition so funny, especially because, even in the Oxford English Dictionary, the way we define naturalize is to become native. And so what they did was they went through the literature, found lots of different sources for the words naturalized and naturalization. They categorized into 4 different categories. But the thing is that they didn't create a category that could encapsulate the sense in which that word means to become native, despite the fact that they actively discuss and also disagree with people who define it in that way. So I would say that they categorically excluded from consideration the sense in which an organism that is not sort of indigenous can integrate by, I would say, almost sort of changing the definition of this word. I spoke with him over Zoom and I asked him why he defined it in that way at that time. And what he told me was that he was generally uncomfortable with what the word implied. So I then started looking for sort of frameworks that describe what I saw, because I wasn't, I felt that the way in which these things had been conceived did not describe what I saw. And so anyway, I scoured the literature. I wasn't able to find some sort of consistent methodology that was able to reproduce results that even I had gotten already for frameworks. So I did a lot of reference tracing. And what I did was I just placed them into two categories of it did describe what I saw and it didn't. Anyway, so these are all the ones that I found. Anyway, the ones in yellow are the ones that didn't describe what I saw. These are the ones that did. It's not super relevant, but this is what's relevant. So the ones that did not describe naturalization, as I understand it, have been cited more than 20 times as often as the ones that did describe something that I saw. And so clearly, the way that we manage invasions, has been heavily influenced by a conception of invasion that has no conception of integration or naturalization, as I would call it. Also, this will become relevant in the next section here, but there's a heavy overlap in the people that conceive of and create these frameworks. David Richardson, chief among them, where there's sort of a tight-knit group of people that sort of create and conceive these frameworks. So this is currently the gold standard for how we describe invasions. I think it's flawed because it doesn't describe what I would call integration or what I would call naturalization or integration. This is what I think is a better description of the process. So I changed the terminology, putting naturalized after invasive. Not all organisms are invasive after they're introduced, and so sort of having two different pathways. But I think what's notable in this framework here is that they suggest that eradication at all stages is wise, and I think that is completely unrealistic, especially with plants. I think we've used a lot of resources to try to manage things that we have no business expecting we can get rid of. And so I think that having an emphasis on restoration rather than eradication is a much more productive approach, because it forces us to think about what we truly think is good rather than what we just don't want. I also think that this approach is much more in line with, this is what's called the invasion curve. It's sort of one of the more modern approaches to understanding what to do in the context of an invasion. And as you can see, we now, I think, generally accept that eradication is really only realistic at the very beginning of an invasion. The last part of this. So I would say that naturalization has been deliberately excluded from consideration in invasion biology, and I don't say that lightly. So in 2017, a couple of authors, including Tim Blackburn, who is the primary author of this framework, began accusing other people of what they called invasive species denialism. The way that they defined that was, it was that someone is denying that invasive species can have negative impacts. And so they would say this is akin to climate change denial and medical science denial, so on. Anthony Ricciardi at McGill and his student Rachel Ryan took this further, accusing 77 specific works of this. And then someone else from, three other people from New Zealand went and reviewed these to see whether they, could come to the same conclusion that these people were actively, engaging in science denial. And they came to pretty well the opposite conclusion, which is that in a lot of those works, and I've gone through a number of them, none of them deny that invasive species have impacts. All of them actively acknowledge that, rather than those works sort of being organized by denying that invasive species have impacts. What I think better organizes those works is that in addition to acknowledging they have impacts, all of these authors were pointing out that invasive species can become unproblematic or provide benefit. And so these authors, I think, were, I don't know why, but you know, it seemed the phenomenon in the literature among the culture of science of these people seems to be excluding from consideration much of the work that would otherwise allow us to begin to account for this phenomenon of naturalization. Indeed, I think a lot of these authors doubled down in 2020, and there's been, you know, I don't think their view has changed. I've met a number of them. You know, they said in an op-ed, 19 of some of the most prominent authors, all of them are either primary or associate editors of the Court Journals of Invasion Biology. So they said, we urge journal editors to reconsider acceptance of denialist essays despite potential boost to impact factor. And 4 of those authors have published some of the most key frameworks for the process of invasion biology. So I think that this constitutes a strong bias against the incorporation of the phenomenon that I observed into the central frameworks that would allow us to account for these things. And subsequently, I think that part of the reason that we don't account for this happening is that there is a prejudicial attitude towards sort of accounting for this phenomenon among the group of people who decide what is valid science within invasion biology. So anyway, I also think that in reading a lot of the discourse that an attitude of I may be wrong and you may be right, but by an effort we may get near to the truth, which is sort of Karl Popper's the last book that he wrote before he died was called The Myth of the Framework. And he reflected that if he were to summarize his understanding of what constitutes good science into 2 lines, that was it. Is that, you know, I may be wrong and you may be right, but by an effort we will get near to the truth. And I think that accusing your colleagues of science denial because you don't like what they're saying is not a great approach and not particularly productive. So in conclusion, I think that Fanwort populations in Kasshabog Lake are a good example of the phenomenon I'm talking about. I think naturalization has been defined and used in the invasion biology literature in a way that categorically excludes the sense in which it refers to integration. And I think that the most cited sort of frameworks we use to describe invasions don't account for naturalization. In terms of what I think is helpful, I think having useful criteria to describe what constitutes naturalization is a good idea, even if these aren't the best ones. You know, this was just a stab at trying to describe something that I think we mean when we use that word in a measurable sense. You know, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this needs to be much more significant in order for us to accept that something has become an integral part of the system. Maybe there's a better way to measure that. You know, this was just a first attempt. And so maybe I'm wrong about Fanwort being naturalized. Nonetheless, I do think that this phenomenon, you know, it must occur. You know, ecosystems on this planet would have ceased to function if they were incapable of integrating new members. And so I think it's not a matter of whether it happens, but how long it takes. And if we don't conceive of it within our frameworks for describing nature, we probably won't look. You know, however long it takes. Maybe it takes a long time. Maybe it takes quite a short time. And so I think that a lot of old data sets and studies can be revisited to assess, you know, whether naturalization has occurred, but using these sort of criteria, because I think that we collect a lot of data, we get obsessed with a new invasive species, and then we sort of forget about it, and then we don't look at what's happening later in more detail. And anyway, so I think that naturalization needs to be incorporated into our understandings of how invasions proceed. I also think it needs to be anticipated in management, because at present, I don't think it generally is. I think that often eradication and control is done because we don't see any other alternative, because you know, there's no conception that it could become part of the ecosystem. If that were to be conceived of, I think that there are, we may see that other approaches may be more acceptable. And I think perhaps probably more in line with the logistical and financial realities of eradication efforts, which, especially with plants, are not often super successful. And I also think that taking an approach that focuses on restoration rather than strict control may allow us to have more focus on more realistic endpoints, because it forces us to think about what we want rather than just what we don't want to be there instead. Because often, I think when we manage, we introduce disturbance in the form of management and can often reperpetuate the same conditions that we're trying to change. Yeah, in terms of terminology, I really, in some respects, I really don't care what you call this. You know, if naturalization etymologically is not the best term to use to describe this phenomenon, then so be it. You know, it was just the word that I went into this with, and understanding, you know, I think that's what that is referring to in reality. But, you know, frankly, I really don't care what you call it. Anyway, so for better ecological management, I think we must naturalize the phenomenon of naturalization to our way of thinking. Thank you very much. Any questions? We could,
So where you had the Karl Popper quote?
yeah,
You had two black swans?
yes,
Can you explain the relevance of that?
okay. I forgot a joke.
Can you
Yeah.
repeat the question for the online?
So the question was explaining the significance of the two black swans. So Karl Popper, in sort of describing the principle of falsifiability, said that, you know, if you make a claim that all swans are white and you find a black swan, that claim is falsified. And so the reason I included this was that I think that good conduct in the discourse has become a black swan that you know, maybe is a form of invasive species that they're trying to eradicate. Anyway, I think that's a bit too maybe rhetorical, but anyway, yeah.
I was curious to know that when you did your scan of the literature and different cases of predation and herbivory, I guess, on different plant species, when we're considering the fact that currently in the case of situation where, well, could this happen globally, but in North America, we're in a situation where we're losing our ash trees. And there's likely a lot of insects, Lepidoptera or otherwise, that rely on ash trees as a host species. If you lose certain host species where there's a lot of species-specific insects in an ecosystem, is it possible that through natural selection that these insects could then be sort of forced to start to herbivorize or eat and use non-native species like the Norway maple, for example,
Right.
as a host species due to the stress that they're experiencing due to the loss of the ash trees.
Right.
This would be broad, just like Mark's example of the garlic mustard. But if a species was stressed to the point where its diet was lost, or they were used as a host species.
Yeah, I don't know. I think there is a literature that exists that looks at sort of rapid evolution, but often that's in the context of introduced species and the ability of native species to adapt to its presence and incorporate it into their diets. So there's some good examples of that. I think there's a man named Scott Carroll who published some work on like soap bugs in Australia and their ability, I think it was Australia. Anyway, so noting that the plasticity of the morphological response was such that those organisms were able to change their morphology quite significantly within a short period of time to adapt to the presence of a new species. In terms of like the other way around, where species are losing their their food, maybe that would happen. I don't know, but I think that's another reason to focus on restoration, which is that rather than getting caught up in, trying to get rid of something, and I think maybe getting distracted by trying to get rid of something, focusing on the things that need help, is a better way to get in the knowledge that things are being lost, because that doesn't necessarily preclude control of species. But I think that's getting away from your question. But but I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Where where insects or species are forced to adapt to a plant species that they're not usually typically palatable.
Yeah.
For them.
Yeah, and like, for instance, with the water soldier I saw the other day with the, what I assume to be a native moth eating the water soldier. You know, it
That's
seems like things can begin eating invasive species quite quickly in certain cases, but yeah, I don't know the extent to which that happens or the rate at which it happens. Yeah.
How are you proposing to differentiate between the species that you see coming on and may or may not naturalize into the environment, and really truly invasive species like Phragmites, for instance?
I think it must occur in all cases, but I think it's a matter of how long it takes. So in Phragmites, maybe I'm wrong, but I think we have a native Phragmites that I think is the same species. Is that true? Is it a different species? Yeah, they do hybridize though, don't they? Yeah, okay. But I guess what I think is that I think it occurs in all cases, even with the things we consider the most invasive. I think that this is a natural process that must occur in all cases. The question is, how long does that take? And then what do you do in the context of the ecosystem you're managing? Because, if it takes a long time, then surely, yes, you probably need to control it to, restore or protect the ecosystem you're working in. But I think that this is a phenomenon that we have not accounted for that I think must occur in all cases. Yeah. And so.
Step back and see, or whether it's important to get on it right away, like in the case of Phragmites.
Yeah. I mean, frankly, I think Phragmites is too far gone now, but I think that, I also don't think it precludes, control at the beginning of, oh, we have not seen that here before. Maybe let's try to get rid of it. I don't think that's a bad idea. I guess I think that yeah, part of the reason that we don't understand how this happens or how quickly it happens is because we haven't bothered to look generally, or look at the reasons why it happens or how quickly, or the factors that explain how quickly or how slowly that would occur.
Many of the invasive species that have become a problem, particularly in our waterways, were brought here as a result of the horticulture industry.
Yep.
Selling to people that want to put them in their ponds, in their backyards, etc. If we ascribe to naturalization as the method we want to go with, doesn't that keep the door open to those practices? Because, okay, if it escapes your pond and it ends up in the river, well, it'll naturalize.
Yeah, good comment. Sorry, everyone online. So the question was, if we begin to account for this, because a lot of introduced species were brought over for horticulture, doesn't that then mean that, there's no point in controlling it? Yeah, because they're just going to naturalize anyway. Do you feel that accurately represents what you said?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't think that precludes border control for preventing introductions. So if we have good suspicion that, a species we think, is, at least initially or for a while going to cause problems, I don't think that means that we shouldn't, attempt to regulate it at the border. Yeah, because clearly invasive species do have impacts, and, in conjunction with all sorts of other pressures, so, like abiotic inputs, from pollution, habitat destruction, so on and so forth. It is an additional sort of what is the right, I don't know what the right word is for that sort of cumulative environmental effect, that we would otherwise want to prevent. So I don't think that, accounting for this happening means that there's no point in border control. Yeah, or preventing imports of new species.
But until it's here and in our ecosystems, how do you know what impact it would have?
I mean, I think that you can use the precautionary principle. Sorry. Until it's here, how would you know what impact it would have on the ecosystem is the follow-up question. I think we can still follow the precautionary principle because there are other similar contexts in which it may have been introduced. Where we can see where we can base our expectations off of those cases. And also that, I think we can follow the precautionary principle. I don't think that just because it might not, doesn't, that it's definitely okay to bring it in. Do you feel that
The follow-up to that is simply, so why don't we do that? I mean, there's so many situations where that's exactly how it happened.
we have
Backyard and it ended up in the river.
right, and so the follow-up question was, so why don't we do that? And yeah, the answer is we do that. So in Ontario, like the Ontario Invasive Species Act has species on it that have not gotten here yet that are subject to import control. Yeah, and so we are beginning to do that. Yeah.
So in follow-up to that are those then species that have been documented elsewhere that they have become invasive?
The question was, so are those species that have been documented elsewhere as being problematic or invasive? Yes, I think in some cases, like some of them I think are in the United States, and we have range data from its native range that we could, reasonably expect that it would do well here. I don't know all the cases. I was looking at that list today, actually. Yeah, I don't know about all cases, but yes, in many cases, a lot of those species that are listed are ones that we would know that we have other information from other contexts on.
So does the term naturalization mean that it actually brings some sort of benefit to the ecological system, or it just plays nice with the ecological system and doesn't take over? To the native insects that live here, right? It'll never become a host plant.
That's not true. Yeah, some plants will. Yep. Yeah. So, sorry. Okay. All right. Let's start from the beginning. The question was, does naturalization mean that brings benefit, or that it's just sort of playing nice, sort of neutral, and then in the ecosystem? And then the second part of that was, do they ever become hosts for native insects? And so the answer to the first part was, I sort of froze. And then the second part was yes, introduced and invasive plants do become hosts to insects. Right at the beginning. So I mean, I think it kind of counts, but this is the milfoil weevil. So Eurasian water milfoil hybridizes with northern water milfoil. The milfoil weevil does love eating Eurasian water milfoil. In other cases, like, I think that example of, what I think is a native aquatic moth species eating water soldier is another example. So these are all in this slide, these are all examples of a native species using a introduced species. So this is a merlin eating a starling. This is a squirrel eating an apple, eastern gray squirrel. This is a red-winged blackbird using Phragmites for nesting. Yeah. And then this is an eagle eating a carp. I think it's eating, yeah. So food web incorporation happens. I think assessing the degree to which connections occur So what proportion, you know, is functions, and how does that match up against analog? Yeah, I think one way to do that.
Obviously, will focus on milkweed, but the dog stranglevine is a
Mm.
milkweed as well. But they try and host on that and then they die.
Yes. Yeah. Example was brought up of monarch butterfly hosting on dog strangling vine versus common milkweed, where when the monarch hosts on the dog strangling vine, it's not capable of supporting the caterpillars and they die. Yeah, so yeah, that is definitely an impact on the ecosystem. I think. Yeah, I don't know. I think that I think that with regard to impacts like that, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what to, like, because I think that it, but I also think that, you know, in terms of the logistical realities of attempting to eradicate, you know, I think it becomes a matter of, then I think it still becomes a matter of focusing on restoration, you know, rather than trying to get rid of something that I really don't think we have, you know, realistic shot of getting rid of.
Further to that, when I first came here about 30 years ago, there was a big concern about purple loosestrife.
Yes.
Has that thinking changed now, or do we view it differently, or we consider it naturalized, or do we still consider it to be a major problem?
Right. So for those online, question is about purple loosestrife. Sort of compared to when you got here 30 years ago, when it was considered a big problem in the 90s. You know, is it still considered a big problem now? And you know, where are we at with regard to sort of our management approach and whatnot?
Bugs or like our insects or
Yeah.
is anything in the ecosystem using it?
Right. So with regard to purple loosestrife, so there was a biocontrol program for it. However, and it's like at a recent workshop with, I think it was the Great Lake Fishery, was it the fish machine? No. Anyway, you know, there are still discussions about managing it. However, I think in terms of my own perspective on purple loosestrife, it's like heavily influenced by, it's an article by a man named Claude Lavoie, published in 2010, called "Should We Care About Purple Loosestrife?" And so what he did in that was take do a historical review of coverage of purple loosestrife and the literature in the context of how the decision was made to launch such a massive management program to manage purple loosestrife. And so some of the things that he found was that there were studies of purple loosestrife. So purple loosestrife has been in North America for over 200 years. There were studies, including from Quebec, where I think it's been for almost, or at least 100 years. I think maybe not quite that long, but I think it was at least there in the 30s or 40s. But that there were studies of wet meadows in which purple loosestrife was present, where it was noted that it was perfectly capable of living in a highly diverse meadow ecosystem. And then, but the evidence that was used to designate it as invasive was based on herbarium samples that recorded its spread. But the thing about that is that with herbarium samples, you can approximate how quickly it's moving, but you can't tell what it's doing in the ecosystem. And so that was the primary piece of evidence that was used to designate it as invasive and motivate management programs, but it wasn't necessarily based on assessment of impact. Yeah. I can send that article to the, if anybody wants that article, I can send it to you. Yeah.
Oh, we have an online comment, so
Oh,
I'll
right.
let you read it. Because this one,
Oh, yeah.
it's kind of more of an observation.
So the observation or comment is, this is not relevant here, not really a question, just a reflection, but I find it fascinating that immigrants who receive citizenship are referred to as naturalized citizens. I'm wondering, when was this word first used? Was it in reference to foreign plants or foreign humans? It becomes more complicated when we introduce invasiveness, quote unquote, as part of this definition. I'm always interested in the words that we choose to use in different contexts and their etymology. So I do know the answer to that because it was part of this. So we first used that word in the context of describing immigration, and then it was transposed onto the plant community. Yeah, so that's also why I think it's strange to use the word naturalized in the sense that many people in literature were using it, because to me, the primary definition of that word is community integration. And so, could I read the second part of that? I got distracted, carried away. Yes, I think it definitely does become complicated when you introduce invasiveness. And there's a lot of, a friend of mine, or someone who became a friend of mine, who's a sort of scholar of, historian of invasion biology. Also, yeah, there's some sort of funny metaphors that go into this that, yeah, anyway, yeah.
More of a comment than a question, I suppose. I find it interesting that when you asked everybody beforehand,
Yeah.
what their definitions of naturalization was, that most of the definitions we gave were in line with your definition and not with the literature definition.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, I wanted, sorry, okay, apologize. For those online, the comment was that when we discussed our own, so got into groups and discussed their own understanding of what that word meant, it seemed to be more in line with the definition I was suggesting rather than the one that was in the literature. Was that did I miss anything?
Yeah, I would just find that
Yeah.
interesting that why, I mean, it's kind of established amongst naturalists, we'll say, that is what the word means, and yet the literature would say otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, I think I also wanted everyone to sort of, like, I was hoping that would also inform discussion later, just so that, this comparison of like, oh, this is what that word means to me, and then, have a debate or discussion about, well, how did you come to understand that word in that way, so on and so forth. And I am inclined to think that, my understanding of most of the people that I've met, that the context of the word naturalized, usually refers to something that you would never expect to be a problem anymore, or as part of a community. And and so I often incorporate that because, it's just a way of, because I think it's an interesting discussion point, because I truly found that that literature was very strange. Yeah, for that reason.
I know you mentioned that you'd spoken to David Richardson. Did he say anything along those lines that, like, he understands that people commonly think of the word naturalization as meaning something different than what he's defining it as?
Right. So the question was, in the context of the conversation I had with Dave Richardson, does he, has he also encountered other people that use it differently than the way that he defined it? Is that the gist of the question? That didn't come up because I was a bit like shell-shocked that he would want to talk to me. I don't know. It's like, oh, all right. And just going into the conversation, knowing how much I disagreed with what he did. But then he was also just quite polite and nice. And I was just like, oh my God. I have sent him some other emails since, but I don't know. Cause I also think that it's like, there's some elements of that definition that it's like, oh yeah, I understand why he defined it in that way to some extent. I guess I think that he was personally uncomfortable with, I think he was uncomfortable with the notion that introduced species could become part of a place. And so it's just like all this stuff that goes unsaid. I don't know that that's definitely true though. So that's important because, I could be wrong about a lot of stuff. But yeah, it just, so no, I didn't ask him that, but, but I did tell him that I sort of found his definition a bit strange.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe one more question?
I think we should put humankind in context with nature in the sense that we only live like 100 years. So there's a sense of arrogance here in what is naturalized, okay?
Yeah.
And, like nature works over millennia
Yeah,
and we noticed loosestrife, for example, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Okay? That's one, but the other thing is all plants engage in chemical warfare. And so, it's a fact.
Yep.
They all engage in chemical warfare. And this is where the naturalization comes in, and this is where I think you're 100% correct. Because plants they evolve to deal with things in their environment.
Mhm.
That's how that's their MO.
Yeah, and the comment was, we have such a short lifespan where we, maybe, what we notice over a short period, may not be a full picture of the natural processes. And that sort of every plant engages in a form of chemical warfare where, that's a way in which those plants will deal with new and introduce sort of other organisms. And I think in the context of that allelopathy, like I think I've seen some studies, especially of garlic mustard, where they notice that its allelopathy drops off the longer it's been in the system. And so other things are able to come in more because it's not as stressed. I think, if we want to impose that, yeah. But anyway, long story short, the allelopathy of garlic mustard does drop off in locations where it's been for a while, and other things are able to come in to a greater degree.
Thank you very much, Nick. Sorry
Yeah.
to cut everybody off. I'm
That's
sure
okay.
there's more questions, but perhaps I can try and get in touch with you somehow.
Oh,
There's a small gift.
If I can remind everybody again that we have a slide showing next month, so try and get in touch with myself or one of the board members so that we can get people organized and slides prepared for everybody to present their slides. Okay, thank you very much, everybody.